Okay, there we go.
I've just clicked continue. Okay, well, I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone on this webinar, hosted on Jolene Young's Heritage Consultancy platform. Thank you all for joining part 3 of this, which is a 6-part series addressing the general question, could human misery in the world be reduced by breaking the chains of repression and revenge? And a question mark. In the panel part of this series on the 17th of October, hope most of the speakers who will have given each of the 6 seminars will participate, and that's when we hope we can actually see what we've learned through this question and if there's a way of going forward with it. Anyway, today's topic is being led by Mark McCormack out of Calgary, which is in Alberta, Canada, and who I'm delighted to welcome and thank in anticipation of his contribution to this series. Mark's topic is on the philosopher Hegel as the means for moving us from the slaughterbench of history to blessedness. It fits rather nicely, in my view, with the series. So thank you, Mark, for joining us in addressing the topic of this series. As you will have seen on the promotional description on Jolene's platform, Mark has a high school diploma and is an ice road trucker. He has spent many thousands of hours studying how to change the world. He has 12 years of transdisciplinary education at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, which is where I met him, as you heard earlier. He has 12 years of transdisciplinary education at the University of Alberta and 10 years of organizing experience with leading in the province of Alberta a movement to make poverty history, along with some 3,000 concentrated hours recently in studying Hegel. He's been known to synthesize theory with practice. Could people who are not speaking please mute themselves? Thank you, thank you. He has been known to synthesize theory with practice and is currently changing Weltgeist into a peaceful revolution to change the world. It was while Mark was at the University of Alberta that I had the pleasure of making his acquaintance. His youthful sincerity and sacrifice, along with his determination to make the world a better place by making poverty history, I found to be especially refreshing and hopeful. In my experience, Mark was different from others his age in that he was willing to invest himself heavily by combining his special intelligence into constructive social movements. You will see that Mark is considerably younger than most of us that you've seen to date on Jolene's platform. It is, in my view, the younger generation that has the burden of continuing with the legacy of what we, the older generation, is passing on to them. As Mark speaks to us, please feel free to use the chat box. I'll be moderating the discussion. Could people please mute so that you do not disturb the speaker, and when you are speaking, then you can unmute? Thank you. So as Mark speaks to us, please feel free to use the chat box. I'll be moderating the discussion. Mark will speak for no more than about an hour so that we have at least some 30 minutes for discussion at the end. So the total time will be about an hour and a half from now. Without further ado then, please join me in welcoming Mark with his remedy to help find ways to fix the world's ills. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Colin. That was very generous of you. And thank you all for coming. I believe what you're about to see is historic and has never been seen before. I truly believe that we are about to change history, not just theoretically or talking, but also in practice and in our actual current historical timeline. And I've titled my talk From the Slaughterbench of History to Blessedness, because that's how we're going to transition our current timeline. And we're going to start now. You may not have heard this talk or some talk like this before, but you may have seen something like this before. You may have seen people in history get locked up for introducing new ideas to their current epoch and then get locked up for it. when you introduce a new idea, it has to be integrated into society. And if the idea is too new, even if it's true, even if it has truth to it, the individuals which usher in that new ideal can experience a backlash that can restrict their rights and freedoms and oppress them. This just happened to me this week. As I was preparing for this talk, my ideas started percolating through our current historical timeline, and I decided to do a hunger strike. I'm very serious about this revolution, this peaceful revolution, and I decided to do this hunger strike because there is a lack of spirit in the world. Number two, 1/3 of all wealth on earth is going to be concentrated into the hands of the 1%, not because there's necessarily evil or terrible people, but because our system is broken. And this is going to happen within the next 10 years by 2030, according to the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report in Switzerland. On top of that, in the next 40 years, or in the past 40 years, real wage has not gone up and it has stagnated continuously. 40 straight years of real wage stagnation. On top of this, I'm also protesting against the $500,000 CRISPR cures that are on their way. There's already 2 CRISPR cures that I saw on the market, and they cost over $450,000 a piece. I am going to have a hunger strike against this to usher in the new ideals of the peaceful revolution. This is a hunger strike. This is not suicide. A few people got together and filed a mental health assessment report and got a judge to sign it. So when the cops came and picked me up, I couldn't resist it, and I had to go to the hospital to be assessed by 3 doctors, and a mental health crisis nurse. Luckily, I got out. I was rational, and what had happened was a misunderstanding, and I clarified that I'm going on a hunger strike. The story continues, and I have the freedom to introduce these new ideas some more. So where should we start? Well, let's start with our current history, the current moment. I truly believe we have a chance to change the world, and we can do it by starting with answering the question of which this series pertains to. It is, could human misery in the world be reduced by breaking the chains of repression and revenge? The short answer is yes. The best answer is not only can we reduce it, but I believe we can eliminate all conflict and misery. I know this sounds incredible, but I truly believe that with these new ideas, we are on our way to a blessed history, not just a lesser version of a Slaughterbench. How are we going to do this? It sounds naive. I know it sounds naive, but how we're going to do this is through something we're calling the peaceful revolution. It has 3 aspects to it. It has spirit, it has something called Wiwa, and something called CRISPR. The first part is called spirit, and it has to do with a cultural revolution. It is a new culture based on Hegelian dialectics, genuine reason, love, and wisdom. The second part has to do with labor. It is called WEWA, the Worldwide Essential Workers App, and it is where the workers own the means of production by owning the app, working for themselves, and then profit sharing to themselves as the app goes worldwide. The third part is the CRISPR Miraculous Cure Corp, and it is the healthcare part of the peaceful revolution, where the workers will own these CRISPR citizen labs and own the patents to their own, the cures to their own diseases. They will then give these cures to themselves as a benefits package for the work they do in WEWA, and it will be given for free, or at least a lot more affordably than $500,000 a cure. But we don't have time to go through all 3 aspects. Today, in this hour, I'm only going to focus on the first part, the cultural part, and arguably an incredibly important part to begin with, and that we should begin with. Before we get into WEWA or CRISPR, we should have a very clear set of norms, a very clear way of doing things, and a very clear language of talking about how we're going to get things done. This is where we have spirit becoming more practical in what we call the spirit mission. The spirit mission is our central cultural document that guides the peaceful revolution and the attitudes in WEWA, the workers, and also in the healthcare system with the CRISPR Miraculous Cure Corp. It's very short. I want to emphasize that even though we have a peaceful revolution that's going to change the world, and we would expect it to be thousands and thousands and thousands of pages long, in essence, it's only 12 pages long with a 72-page explanation. This doesn't mean it's naive or that it's not powerful. It means that it is concise and very efficacious. It contains a very powerful logic within it that our current society lacks, which is why we have an information abundance and an information overload that we can barely keep up with. And it is exponentially increasing and overwhelming us in creating a new anxiety society, a society where we're all overworked. We are 24/7 connected. We feel like there's never enough time, and that we see in rich and poor countries alike, anxiety and depression are both going up. Okay, this is because we have a cultural problem, and we're going to solve it very efficaciously and very quickly. I'm hoping to cover all of it within this hour. So I've been teaching this spirit mission for about 7 cycles now, 7 iterations we've had to improve the teaching, which is about 3.5 months out of about 2 weeks per cycle. And it has the spirit mission has an introduction, it has 12 sections, and it has a summary. And what I found when I was teaching it through these 6 pedagogical steps is that there was a problem, that the way I was teaching it is very hard to grasp. So what I'm going to do today is I'm not going to start where I normally start. I'm going to start in a different way, and hopefully it'll become more clear what we're trying to teach here. So I'm going to start with this slide. You are trapped. Everybody listening to this presentation right now, whether currently or in the future, if you have ordinary thinking, if you are a product of the contemporary culture of our time, you are trapped. You are trapped in something called ordinary thinking and ordinary history. If you do not do something universal, you will not be remembered in history. You will not be essential to history. And this is just a sad fact of having this ordinary way of living not be appreciated or not being a part of a different kind of history. But at the moment, you really need to know that the way we think in our current culture is one where we're trapped. Let me explain. There's 2 types of thinking that we're going to cover. There's, of course, on the left side, ordinary thinking, and on the right side, dialectical speculative thinking. In the middle, you can very, very clearly see, but it's very small, something called divine logic at the top of the slide. It is very small compared to the other 2, because this is what is missing in contemporary society. And it is very hard to expose between these 2 modes of thinking, between ordinary thinking and this dialectical speculative thinking. It unites them. And let's just go through ordinary thinking. What is it? Why are you trapped? Why are we all trapped? The 5 traits of trapped ordinary thinking is number 1, negation or neurotic thinking. Even in healthy modes of thinking, it is still considered neurotic compared to where we are going with this blessed history. Okay, we usually think in healthcare systems, mental illness is on the rise, at least awareness of mental illness is on the rise. And that we say today in contemporary society, people who have pathological symptoms are considered unhealthy and they're considered neurotic. And then we have healthy people who are functioning in society. But compared to this new way of thinking that I'm about to introduce, even the healthy way of thinking in our current society is considered unhealthy. It is still considered neurotic. So the pathological mental illness in our current society and the healthy form of communicating are both considered negation or neurotic. Number 2, it's neurotic because it's one-sided. That might not make sense to you right now, but hopefully it will by the end of this presentation and by the next slide. Everybody's very one-sided. Number 3, it's very volatile. It's very violent. It's a process of thinking where it creates the other. It operates by negation, where it says, this other thing to me is not me, therefore it must be my enemy. And I do not like or understand my enemy, therefore I must destroy it. This is where the violence comes in, and this is where it underlies a crucial process or crucial logic, which leads to the Slaughterbench. Okay, number 4, accidental. A lot of the free will, a lot of the choice that we have in ordinary thinking in society is not true free will. It's just accidental. It's what Hegel calls stabbing in the dark. And it's very hit or miss. Sometimes you will have some kind of wisdom. Sometimes it'll work for you, sometimes it won't. And people create all types of symbols to try and figure out why it works and why it doesn't work, but it's very accidental with ordinary thinking. Number 5, it's very contingent. It's very piecemeal. It's very fragmented thinking. So it's dependent on other events which seem unstable, or there's no real necessity to them. There's no real reason. Okay, this is predominantly what we would call colonial law. If Kathleen Mahoney was on the call, she would see that this is what she's been fighting against in her lawsuits. Now, the other side of the other kind of thinking that we need to embrace is something called dialectical or speculative thinking. This is very unfamiliar. It is not known in contemporary society, which is why you will never have heard this before unless you've studied Hegel directly. This has come from a philosopher named Hegel. He lived in the 1800s, and he invented a philosophy which has not been repeated in 200 years and has not been understood in 200 years. And I believe myself and a few others are the first to understand him, because I spent about 3,000 hours reading his works directly. And they're very, very deep and very, very difficult for ordinary thinking to comprehend, because it is very clear, whereas our ordinary thinking is not clear. So we project our unclarity onto his writing. What he is trying to inspire within us is a dialectical or speculative thinking, which requires us to grasp the concept of sublation. So how dialectical thinking differs from neurotic thinking is that instead of thinking in negation, you think in something called sublation. You will have never heard of sublation before. It is completely missing in our global culture, not just in Canada, all around the world. If we would have paid attention to Hegel, it would now be a part of our universal global culture. But what happened is that Hegel was suppressed and oppressed through the Slaughterbench of history. So after he died, everybody sort of ganged up on his philosophy for 200 years, except for a few outliers, and it was never really brought to full acceptance. But now there's a renaissance happening. There's a revival of Hegel. And to prove it, there's a group on Facebook that has 25,000 people in it wanting to know what Hegel has said. This is unheard of. This is like people joining a group to study symbolic logic or like the axioms of mathematics. Extremely abstract, very difficult to understand. But to see so many people in this Facebook group is a sign that there truly is there is a direction that people are looking for, and that Hegel is being recognized as the only one that provides that direction. And that direction is towards dialectical speculative thinking, which is about sublation, which is about this sort of divine logic. It is opposite of negation. Number 2, this kind of sublative thinking is freedom. It's not this one-sided thinking, it's two-sided thinking. Number 3, it's not about it's not volatile or violent. It's about flowing. It's about blessedness. It's about harmonious thinking. Number 4, instead of being accidental, it is intentional. It is about intentional wisdom that we can actualize through our own will and self-thinking, our self-determined reason, which is number 5. Instead of being contingent and dependent on worlds of the events of the world, which seem to be piecemeal and unconnected, there is a necessity underlying everything in the world. There is a reason to it, a holistic thinking where everything in the world is not seen as fragmented, but is seen as a whole, as a one unity. And this is sort of what indigenous law approximates. It sort of incorporates these soft principles, but Hegel does it based on this logic. And the logic is what is missing in our contemporary society, that differentiates between when you're thinking ordinarily through ordinary thinking and when you're actually thinking with speculative dialectical thinking, which is completely missing the world over. So to give you a better picture of what this logic is, this divine logic that is missing, I have this little diagram that you can now see on the screen. The red lightning bolts is ordinary thinking. It is pointing at the first circle, which is dialectical side 1. This is the one-sidedness that I was talking about in the previous slide. Ordinary thinkers think of the world in an abstract, unconnected way. They do not see dialectical side 2, which is on the opposite side of this diagram. They move through the world saying, my truth is the only truth. Anything that is different from me must be wrong. It does not belong to me. Therefore, it can be destroyed and it must be eliminated from my worldview. So abstract ordinary thinkers, whenever they come up to an idea that is different from theirs, immediately negate it. In fact, ordinary thinking believes that free will is negation, that they have an ability to destroy or negate something that is not them. And so that's what they do. It's the only option that they have. They don't know that sublation exists. And if you aren't aware of sublation, then the only choice that your consciousness has is negation. And that is the culture that we're in around the world, except for small pockets here and there. So we have negation. The lightning bolts are pointing to one side of the dialectic, okay? This leads to volatility. When number 2 is seen, it'll cause a back and forth that's very violent. It'll want to be this destructive dynamic. And it leads to an accidental wisdom where even if they are right, they won't really know why. If they win the battle and they kill the other, they won't really know why. They'll just know that they embody something that was stronger. And this lacks reasoning. This is a very contingent way of moving forward in history. Okay, but now, before I move to the next slide, maybe I'll point to this bottom part of the diagram, which is dialectic image. It has this tangle of lines. It's a rat nest. There is this logic in our minds that to ordinary thinking, because it's abstract, it sees the world in this sort of rat's nest kind of way. It doesn't feel very safe. So that's why a lot of people who are ordinary thinkers think that human nature is necessarily evil or bad, because they see a lot of conflict in the world. And it's because we have unclear thinking. We have a lot of rat's nest thinking through this abstraction, and it leads to a crap load of negation rather than sublation. So what's the other option? The other option is dialectical or speculative thinking. Okay, this is what this teal line represents. It's a circle. It's where you embrace the entire dynamic, where you're not abstract. You actually see dialectical side 1 and dialectical side 2, and you understand in your own consciousness that they belong together. So there's no sense in fighting or negating them. You should actually embrace the truth of them, but cancel the limit between them that differentiates them, that makes the positions different. When you understand what makes the positions different, then you understand the reasoning behind them, and you can reason through them with an intentional wisdom. This is the logic of speculative thinking. It is what in history all of these religious movements were trying to approximate. All these divine teachers, these gurus, these people that seem to see beyond their epoch and their historical limits, beyond the violence, beyond the slaughterbench, and seem to be pointing towards a better future, a better way to have societies, a better way to make history and to leave a lasting memory or a legacy. And this circle represents a holistic way of going about this logic. D1, side 1, D2, side 2. In the middle is 3, which is the gray area, which we all have experience of. And then there's something called D4, which is the ascent to synthesis. It's the point of wisdom that is off that conflicting dialectic, and you look back on that dialectic between two moving sides, and this is where reason comes in, and you know them in their truth. And when you know them in their truth, you know which side to choose intentionally. It's not accidental. It's not contingent. It has necessity to it. And this necessity is based on this divine logic. This divine logic is the same as scientific logic, but not just any scientific logic, what we will come to know as infinite scientific logic. Okay, but I'm pointing out here that this is the logical structure of speculative thinking compared to ordinary thinking or abstract thinking. All right, this leads to the next slide, which is very similar to the one between ordinary thinking on the right, on the left, and then speculative thinking, which was on the right side. But now in this slide, we're not talking about thinking necessarily in our own minds. Now we're talking about history. But the thing that needs to be seen here is that history is a result of subjectivity. It is a result of nature moving through the consciousness of human beings, and human beings being able to interpret the past through their own consciousness. All right. And what we'll see here is a similarity, that history goes through the same sort of process that our minds do, our individual minds do. Our collective minds form history, and it can either be in this ordinary sort of history, which is the Slaughterbench, or it can be in this sort of dialectical speculative mode of thinking, or blessed history. So now we're starting to understand the title of the talk. There's an opposition between Slaughterbench history and blessed history. It has to do with this way of logic that moves through our subconscious minds that generates memories that we see as history. We can also see that the Slaughterbench or history can also have attributes. We have a history that can be neurotic. It can be one-sided, a history that can be volatile or have periods of violence or war. It is accidental. When we look back, we see the agents of that history being very, very much, we look at them and we make fun of them sometimes because now we know better than they do. We see that they made gods out of clay. They took ordinary sensuous things around them, and they were trying to approximate what we now know today as maybe science or a more clear conception of the reasoning behind what they were struggling with at the time. They're very contingent, very natural beings tied to the earth. This is the Slaughterbench kind of history. The blessed history is a product of the speculative thinking. We see people that have sublative thinking. They're rising above the contingency of their point in history, their natural mode or their immediacy. They start thinking with a deeper reason. And as history progresses, we can kind of see these traits emerging. But they have not completely emerged. This is what Hegel says is theoretically possible. And what we have been experiencing for most, in fact, all of human history up until maybe 100 or 200 years ago, is basically this Slaughterbench. It is where you have human beings actualizing themselves in time in a very painful way, where they're going from one side to the other. You know, you have one nation represent one kind of dialectic, one position. And then when they see the other, maybe in a different nation, they'll destroy them. They'll go to war. And same with the other side of the dialectic, they'll also be abstract, see the opposite and go and destroy them. And whichever army wins is sort of a victory for the global mind. Okay, world spirit is what Hegel calls it. And it's very, very painful, but it's still a way to progress. Spirit, or this world mind, does progress through this very violent process, but it's very slow. Blessed history is a lot more peaceful, and it's a much better progress. Here's a good example. There's a lot in the slide, but here's a more concrete example to show you what I mean. We do not ordinarily think of history in this way. This is a very Hegelian way of looking at history. So on the left, we have the Slaughterbench, and we have the right, blessed history. We have on the left, time. If you see that arrow time, it moves up. It goes from far in the past to till now, the present. Okay, this is real time, what we understand as real time. But Hegel says, actually, there is a realm of pure thought called the supersensuous realm. This is where the divine logic lives. It is actually timeless. It is where the pure categories of self-thinking thought think themselves instantly and immediately and eternally. This realm is not just in our minds. Our minds are connected to this realm, but it's not just in our minds. This is the mistake that philosophers have made up until Hegel. They say the categories of our human thinking are finite only. They're only human thinking. These categories that we project onto the world don't actually exist in themselves. They're just a product of human minds. And that's why we misunderstand all the world all the time, is because these categories aren't true. They're made up by humans. But that's not what happens, Hegel says. The reality is that these categories come way before humans, and they are eternal, and they exist of their own accord. We do not need humans to think them. So then what thinks these categories of pure thought? Well, Hegel says nothing but the categories themselves. Because they're eternal, they can't rely on anything that is not them. So they only think themselves from within themselves. This is a very difficult self-reflexive process that human beings in ordinary thinking have a very hard time grasping. But Hegel shows how the categories of pure thinking develop themselves through the necessity of what's called the dialectic, right? And most of human history has not grasped this process. Even the best philosophers of time have not grasped it. Hegel is the only one. Even now, 200 years later, nobody has grasped it, even though he has written it out until recently. And so there is a history too, where these categories of pure thought think themselves and they develop, but they do it in conceptual time, not in actual space and time, not actual what he calls sensuous time, okay? But now in sensuous time, which is our history, right? We have real time, but there are also these categories developing along with us, but we don't see them. They're in the supersensuous realm. But Hegel says we did start becoming conscious of these categories at some point in real time. And it started in 640 BC with a philosopher named Thales, very, very old philosopher. And he says, this man is the contingent formulation of thought. It is a man that ushered in the first genuine philosophical pure thought that was separated from this sensuousness. And I represent it on the right side as a teal block. It's not a circle. It's just a very general, this man Thales understood that through the world that he was looking at, there was something general going on, something that was pure thought that was disconnected. It was connected. It was connected, but it wasn't entirely trapped in the sensuous realm. And this is where the first thought grasped itself. Pure thought was thinking itself through this man named Thales. But it was limited. He was trapped in his time and he couldn't develop this further. So what happened is history had to develop until the next philosopher came and discovered the next pure thought. And his name was Xenophanes. And he came over 100 years, almost 100 years later in 570 BC. And he turned this general pure thought medium into a more specific first pure category of thinking called pure being. Hegel says even in the blessed world, in the timeless world, in the supersensuous world, everything begins with this pure thought of pure being, where pure being and pure thought are the same. This is very abstract, I know, but humans had to suffer a horrendous amount through the Slaughterbench of history to discover this pure being. When this Xenophanes said everything is pure being, there was a whole bunch of people in his time that said, no, you're wrong. Everything is pure nothing, the opposite. Because nothing can, they had a bunch of wars, and I don't have time to go into it, but he developed this first very important category of pure being. Then right after him, when he died, this guy named Zeno came in the Eleatic school, and he carried it further. And he said, well, actually, there's pure being and there's pure nothing, and they move back and forth. They're necessarily connected. They belong together. And this is the dialectic proper. This is the first time in human history this pure thought has come forward. Now, this other incredibly important movement came through another man named Heraclitus. These are all philosophers. And he discovered the category of pure becoming, which involves the category of pure being and pure nothing and the dialectic all. And that's once connecting these three teal circles. Grasp something in its dialectic, it means you grasp it in its opposition, but in its necessary opposition. You grasp connectedness of the thoughts. Okay, so we're moving from abstract thinking to more and more and more concrete thinking. And in history, we have to have lots of fights over these pure categories in order to distill them from the sensuous realm into the supersensuous understanding. This is the building of reason. It's very, very slow speculative thinking. It's how ordinary thinking is separating itself from sensuous nature and reconnecting with this supersensuous realm of perfect logic, of perfect reason, where everything is in harmony. And I'm just giving you an example of historical figures that have done this in time. That's why we're remembering them 2,000 years later. It's because when you do something that is blessed, then you get preserved. The universal of what you've discovered, the pure thought, is preserved because it has truth. Okay, we're doing this right up until today, but I don't have time to go through 2,000 years of history. This is just what's been going on as we untangle the history of the past and as people forge their way forward. If you look at the current slide, this is just Hegel. For the scholars out there who might see this presentation, this is just a quote from Hegel saying that this progress is happening in history. Here's a much more full, it's a very full slide, but it's very important, okay? This is how we're going to transition from the Slaughterbench of history to a blessed history. This is a very controversial slide if there are any Hegelian scholars watching, because contemporary understanding of Hegel is that you can never escape the negation. You can never escape the Slaughterbench. That means for all of us who are suffering right now during the pandemic, that is a very bad thing, because it means we're going to continue to suffer forever. And a lot of people don't like Hegel because all the philosophers in the last 200 years interpret him in this one-sided way, where it's very, very pessimistic that you can't ever get away from the Slaughterbench. But actually, when I read Hegel for 3,000 hours, I discovered that it's only in the beginning and up until about the halfway of his philosophy that he says that. After this point, it actually starts to transition. He transitions you to what's called a blessed history, a universal history, which overcomes the negation and is a history of sublation. But Hegel is so incredibly profound and difficult to understand and torturous for ordinary underthinking that most people give up before they get to this point. But I was lucky that I made it and I broke through, and it was very painful. But here in this picture is how it's going to happen. So at the very bottom of the slide, we have both sides, time and timelessness. Now that you guys understand that there's this pure logic happening through sensuous reality, through our contingent bodies, right? It starts off as this sort of what Hegel calls implicit spirit, unknown spirit. It doesn't know that it's spirit. It's just pure nature working through the laws of physics, chemistry, stuff like this. But it permutates and it combinates, and it starts to evolve into eventually human form. And this is what abstract spirit is. It's where we become self-conscious, but we don't become so self-conscious that we realize that what is other to us is still just ourselves. We still think there's an outside world which we have to fight with. And so everything up until this point is very painful. It's the Slaughterbench. But then you can see on the right-hand side that I say there's pure abstract thought. That's the first, that's Thales, and then we come with Xenophanes, and we get pure being in the dialectic, and then we get pure becoming with Heraclitus. And then you can see across the whole screen, there's this teal line that separates the bottom 2/3 of the screen from the top third. The Slaughterbench is everything below this line, and just above it is where blessed history begins. And it's where pure finite science begins. This is where we realize the explicit process of the categories, the development of these pure categories. We realize not just the categories, but we realize the laws of how to develop those categories. The laws of how to develop those categories is what we call science, but we're not doing it right. Even science has to develop from its abstract form to its concrete form through history. And that's what we've been doing for about 500 years. And the very first historical agent to grasp this scientific meta, even in a finite way, was Francis Bacon, Hegel says. And he said, we have to study empirical science. We have to understand reality and take these pure laws out of reality. And we can't get lost in this abstract spiritual world, which religion says was where we need to go, and where these divine teachers say we need to go, but that it was corrupt in some way, that people were grasping the sensuous version and corrupting the spiritual teachings. And so we got finite science forming, but there's a problem with finite science. It's still fragmented. It doesn't grasp this holistic thinking. It actually is still abstract. It still has negation in it, and it negates religion and negates all this sort of love and fluffiness. Technical scientists are often very cold. And that's why a lot of people think that science cannot say anything about morality, because there is no objective morality. It's all subjective. It's whatever nation you're in, whatever culture you're in. There's no one law that governs us all. All right. And Francis Bacon in history just developed this. Then we had Galilei, who said, the world is not, the universe isn't revolving around the earth. We're actually a planet revolving around the sun, which is revolving around something bigger. And then we had Newton, which developed the first principles of finite science into physics. And then we had Einstein, which takes them to an even more concrete form by saying that, even space and time are connected in a necessary sort of relationship, which Hegel actually already said that way before Einstein, but he was suppressed, right? So all these guys are developing what Hegel already developed in a very concrete philosophy. They're just redoing it, but they're doing it in an abstract, fragmented way, which is why history is still painful, but it's getting more blessed. It's getting less and less painful as nations become more and more rational through science. Science is uniting all the nations around the world very slowly, but it's happening. But we will not break out of this sort of semi-Slaughterbench, semi-blessed history until we reach the next teal line. The next teal line is where something incredibly important is going to happen and has not happened yet, but seems imminent. This is why there's 25,000 people in a Hegelian group when most people have been avoiding him for 200 years. It's because we are in a period of sensuous history where science has upgraded itself and purified itself to the point of where we're ready to grasp the genuine philosophical understanding of what science is. And this is what Hegel calls the pure infinite science, not the finite science, the pure infinite science, where everything is interconnected and not seen as fragmented. And this one science is what religions were trying to approximate in the past. That's why this pure infinite science isn't like pure finite science, which is going to negate everything in religion. This is very important if we're going to make a true peaceful revolution, because we will not change the world unless we figured out what these religious teachers were trying to say. And the truth is there is some logic to what they were saying, but their followers were getting trapped in the sensuousness of it. Okay, the sensuousness is the problem, not the truth, not the reasoning that the teachers or the prophets or the divine ones were trying to show us. They were actually pointing to this blessed world of pure logic, the divine logic, and the ordinary thinkers around them were getting trapped in the negation of their own thinking. Okay, we're about to break out of this, but we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because 85% of the human species is stuck in religious thinking. We are never going to convince them to come on board with a peaceful revolution if we negate them entirely. So we have to do something called sublation, which is accept the truth and distill it into this pure divine logic, so that the sensuousness is beautiful poetry, and that the truth of the religion comes out as this pure philosophical understanding of the infinite science. This is going to unite the contemporary science of today, the scientists of, the people going to the space station, the people, doing CRISPR and genetic research. It's going to unite even the atheists with the religious people of the past. And we're going to have one incredible unity happening, one harmony of thinking that used to be creating a Slaughterbench effect. Now it's going to be creating a harmonious effect through this pure infinite science. And it's the one that Hegel shows us the way. And he does it in a book called The Science of Logic. Okay, so this is the point of history. This is how we're going to make the transition point. And we are at that transition point in our current timeline. We're very, very lucky that we now have a chance to break out of the Slaughterbench through the process of infinite science. And this is the beginning of true spirit. Remember, at the bottom of the screen, we have implicit spirit or unknown spirit. Then we have abstract spirit as self-consciousness, but very nascent, sort of early self-consciousness, which is still fighting with other nations and other things. Now we're realizing a much higher concrete version of thinking, which is the true higher spirit that is missing in our world. Okay, so this is how we should understand history in a genuinely philosophical sense, not in a finite way. And as long as we understand history in an ordinary sense, like what the historians have been doing for 2,000 years, we will never break out of this abstract version of history and never recognize these divine categories that are immanent within it. I'm not sure what time it is. I hope we have enough time to go through this. I wonder if I could just quickly check.
You've got 10 more minutes, Mark, if you're worrying about timing.
Okay, 10 more minutes before questioning. So that's the main point of my talk, and that's how the title got developed. How we're going to transition from the Slaughterbench of history to the blessed history is considered impossible, even by Hegelians today. And I'm one of the first Hegelians, or one of the first genuine philosophers, I suppose, to say that no, there is a way to transition, but it means we have to have a real understanding of what science is supposed to be and what spirit is supposed to be. And so my attempt to bring this into our current timeline is through the peaceful revolution. This is how we're taking this understanding that Hegel discovered 200 years ago and bring it back into our current history. And it's through this peaceful revolution, starting with spirit mission. So spirit mission is a way to teach this genuine philosophy. And I just showed you how history has evolved to get us to this point. Okay, but the spirit history, the spirit mission is teaching what kind of ways of thinking are critical to maintaining a genuinely philosophical state of mind that is harmonious, that is this speculative dialectical logic, where anybody that you can come across in any nation worldwide, anybody that wants to join the peaceful revolution, you can see their ordinary thinking and instead of negate them, sublate with them, create a harmony. And I put in here an example of the first section. So we can try and teach the first section or the introduction of spirit mission in the next 10 minutes and leave the other 12 sections for perhaps the future for anybody who is inspired by this and realizes that we can end a huge amount of suffering that has been building up through human history, through the Slaughterbench. So very quickly, the teaching of spirit mission is very difficult for ordinary thinking. So we developed the spirit pedagogy that divides each of the sections into 6 steps. And the first step is talking about a problem that needs to be solved. And I suppose before we get into the problem, we should state what is spirit mission's purpose? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? The world is a complex place. The peaceful revolution has to have a solution that's sophisticated enough to handle a multitude of complex conflicts. So it simultaneously has to be simple enough for people to grasp the essence, but also complex enough to hit the root of the problem. To state the true complexity of the solution of what spirit mission is going to teach is in this paragraph in the introduction. And I'll read it, and some parts of it you will understand because of explanation. Here it is. So we summarized our entire mission in a single paragraph. It goes like this. It's very complicated. To liberate an abundance of genuine freedom, the spirit mission sublates and therefore transcends the bad, infinite, and all finite processes, distortions, and untrue thinking, which trap consciousness in neuroticism, despair, and double binds. Through our actions, thoughts, and beliefs, we will generate a new total culture of genuine reason, love, and wisdom for all those in, of, and from the spirit of mutual self-recognition and respect. Actual freedom sublates the dichotomy of necessity and caprice and will be made manifest to the greatest extent possible to maximize the actual and potential beauty of the moment for all. Ultimately, the result will be a culture of flow, both within and without, as we begin to embody this absolute logic, science, spirituality, and philosophy in its essential and complete realization. This was discussed in the previous slides. All of this was discussed using maybe different words, but you have now understood what ordinary thinking is, how it traps people in despair and neuroticism, how there's this process of freedom that develops through a logic in history, and where it eventually frees us through this logic into a higher level of science, spirituality, and philosophy, where we can realize a deeper nature to history that unites us instead of divides us. To make it simple, though, most people won't understand that paragraph. So we made the mission very simple. We took an example out of corporate documentation, and we said, okay, well, usually you have a mission statement and then a vision statement, and it's very simple. So ours can be summed up in a single word. It is love. And it can be summed up in 3 words: genuine reason, love, and wisdom. And it can be summed up in a sentence: to guide all projects like the Worldwide Essential Workers app, or WEWA, and the CRISPR Miraculous Cure Corp, which are the 2 other aspects of the peaceful revolution. We're trying to guide them with genuine reason, love, and wisdom. And then we can summarize, we can go a little bit further by saying we're advocating for ethical use of CRISPR, unionizing with these apps that are subjugating people, and that we want to develop our own ethical workers apps so that the workers own the means of production and have the reasoning dictate them towards this higher blessed sort of logic, this history that they also participate in meaningfully. But the problem that we want to solve with this mission statement is very, very powerful, but very broad. So pedagogical step number one is that we need to solve this problem of enough love in the world if we're ever going to have a chance of achieving this blessed history. This is a universal problem all the world over. Pedagogical step gives a couple of examples of this problem that's very real in our current timeline. And if you notice, I give 5 examples and they are just the session of this series. Each of the speakers is tackling a particular version of a lack of love in the world, whether it's apartheid Africa, whether it's indigenous genocide in residential schools with Kathleen Mahoney, whether it's slavery and transatlantic slave trade, whether it's the merchants of doubt and selfish science, which Colin will be talking about, or it's about hardening criminals through our prison systems, which dehumanize humans and cause and rather than embrace their deeper humanity through this deeper spirit. The truth of human nature is this spirit of blessedness and this logic, this deeper infinite science. And these are true particular problems in our current timeline that represents the lack of love and the limits of our current culture globally. So the third pedagogical step is saying, okay, well, what's the solution? And we have to boil it down very simply and grasp the essence, the logic. The logic is what is missing that transitions ordinary thinking to this profounder speculative or true, genuinely philosophical thinking of wisdom that has sublation, that creates harmony. And so ordinary words that can solve this problem are, number 1, genuine philosophy, number 2, spirit and his love. But the problem is ordinary thinking.
Mark your voice,
but it is unclear and have the logic.
Excuse me interrupting, Mark.
Am I breaking up?
Yeah, your voice is breaking up. Could you do something that might fix it on your side with maybe you're holding your finger over your microphone? I'm not sure.
Is that better?
That's perfect. Yeah, yes, that's good. Yes.
So we want to have a clear understanding of these words and what the logic is around them, because if you look in the red there, that is what ordinary thinking in our current historical timeline thinks those words mean, but it's not the real definition, right? Genuine philosophy, most people don't understand that there's a difference between genuine philosophy and abstract philosophy. The philosophy that we teach today is not real philosophy. It's a fragmented version that treats philosophy as another domain of academia alongside physics, math, all the other domains, but that's not genuine philosophy. Real philosophy is at the very top, and it expresses itself through all the other domains. But we're missing the wisdom in those domains, which is why we're creating technologies that are exponential and can destroy us. Our culture is not wise enough. It's not advancing at the same rate as the technological side of things. So we want to clarify this. Spirit is also very nebulous. It's supposed to be only religious. It's not very scientific. Love, most people don't understand what love is, but they can give you the 5 different forms, whether it's self-love, work love, friendship is supposed to be a form of love, romantic love, guru love. But this is not the logic of love, it's just the forms. So pedagogical step 4 is about providing this true clarity, the true philosophical, logical understanding of these words. And we show that in teal here. Genuine philosophy is about clarity and learning this divine logic that only Hegel gives. Spirit is about this concrete, universal self-consciousness, which we see evolving through history. And then love is not these different forms, but these different forms share the same logic, and that is self-recognition. You can only love something that's other to you if you self-recognize with it. If you don't recognize yourself in it, you can't love it. It will be other to you. You will hate it. It will be your enemy. You will get a divorce, stuff like that. This is very simple, but this clarity is very profound. All conflict is due to misunderstanding and poor logic. Okay, so now let's apply this clarity to the problems that we had earlier. We see that pedagogical step 5 applies this clarity on these words and shows that whether it's apartheid Africa, indigenous genocide, slavery, or the transatlantic trade, or merchants of doubt and the finite scientists, we see that all these examples are really just the same lack of clarity on these words. There's a lack of love, a self-recognition in the world. There's a lack of spirit. There's a lack of understanding ourselves as a part of the same global consciousness logically. And then genuine philosophy is lacking because we only have finite philosophy. We don't have finite logic that's fractured, even in our modern scientific systems. Okay, we need to insert these back into the world in order to resolve any of these conflicts. And when we do that, we will resolve the negation that's persisting in them. And that's what each of the speakers is doing in the series, is they're just giving you the particular details that we need to sublate with this logic to overcome the negation that they're exposing. That's all that we're doing in the series. But Hegel is the only real solution that is deep enough to actually reach the logical, permanent solution that leads to a blessed history. Otherwise, we're just applying finite science, which is going to preserve the fragmented thinking, which is why these problems still exist today and why there's still repression and still resentment and a lack of forgiveness. We see this reverberating in our societies all over the world. So pedagogical step six is the final step, where when we solve these particular problems, we realize that all problems in the world are just the same thing. It's all just a lack of clarity. It's all just a lack of universal self-consciousness. It's a lack of self-recognition in the other. But when we realize that this divine logic, this infinite science as a bridge between the religious mode and the modern technical scientific mode is universal, it applies to all particulars. That means all conflicts on earth, whether it's marriage, between people, between nations, between animal and human, between physics and spiritual divine truth and the superessential. All of it is just the same logic. And Hegel's the one that pieced it all together. And if we understood his writings, we can go beyond him and transition our historical timeline from this fragmented one to this one where there is enough love in the world, because we see ourselves scientifically in everything. We understand these divine categories behind everything, and we can use our self-will to align with that. And this is where we have enough love in the world. And how do we know we have enough love in the world? It's when nobody gets left behind. That is the standard that we use in the peaceful revolution. Not a single person, whether you're a criminal, black, white, male, female, rich, poor, everyone is essential when they work for WeWa. Everybody's essential, and they get CRISPR cures affordably. They have their spirit liberated in spirit mission, and this will be the peaceful revolution. This is the answer to the question of this series. Could human misery in the world be reduced by breaking the chains of repression and revenge? We know the answer is yes, but now we also know we're not just going to reduce, we're going to completely eliminate conflict through this incredible scientific awareness of the true logic of reality and our relation to it directly. This is the ideal answer and the best answer to get rid of repression and revenge permanently. But how are we going to do this? How are we going to make this blessed history? Let's go back to, let's go from the theoretical back to our current timeline. This is why I'm in my car. This is why I was sent to the mental hospital and luckily got out, because of the rationality that I have in my life, in my thinking. That the insanity that's seen in my thinking is the projection of the limits of our current finite thinking, of ordinary thinking, onto this new ideal whose time has come. And if those who have stuck with me through the Make Poverty History period are watching this, you'll see that the title is Make Blessed History. This is an extension of all that work we did into two tools. The tools of how we're going to reduce this repression and revenge completely and to attain this blessed history through this transition into genuine philosophy is starting with this document, this spreadsheet that already exists called the Dictionary of Tisdom, where we're translating Hegel's incredible writings into a much more understandable form, where we can use it to provide clarity on a myriad of topics in society that are in conflict right now. It is an incredible way to look up and clarify a topic in record time. It is a dictionary of true wisdom. Tisdom is what we're calling it, so that it doesn't get confused with ordinary thinking's version of wisdom, which is unclear. And the second document is an expansion of this Dictionary of Tisdom that we're calling the Synchronicity Document of Philosophies. And it is another spreadsheet where we're taking all the ideologies of time, of which Hegel talks about in his History of Philosophy, and we're showing that they're all doing the same thing. And we're matching them up, and we're saying they're all speaking the same logical language using different sensuous symbols. All the conflict in the world is due to this sensuous attachment and mismatching of the logic. So we're going to purify this logic, and we're going to provide a map, a conceptual map, where we're not just translating traditional languages like English into French, into Hindi, into all these other languages, but there are conceptual, symbolic languages in all of these these countries and these cultures that need to transition into each other fluidly. And we don't have this conceptual translator. We only have these formal translators. And this is the first beginning, the nascent form of the actual blessed translation into each other's cultures, without the colonial mode, without having to repress or negate. We can actually adopt everybody's symbols as a form of poetry and bring out the logic inherent in them, that's immanent in them, which makes them beautiful. This means that we can have a divine logic the world over, but we can also have an infinite amount of diversity. The logic unites us, and the diversity is an expression of that unity in our history. Okay, so this is how we're going to start bringing this amazing logic into the world very practically and make blessed history happen for real. To accelerate this, to make this real so that the limits of our time doesn't throw us back into the mental asylum or represses us like they did for Hegel, we need an event that makes us go global very quickly before we can be suppressed. This is the point of the hunger strike. This is the point of all the sacrifice that I have made for the last 6 months with the union, with the Uber skip drivers, with CRISPR, with everything that I've done. This is the point, and it's culminating in the hunger strike that we're going to try and make go worldwide. The refugees, the oppressed, we're reaching out all over the world with Facebook to go into all these cultures and say, do you want to have a higher spirit in this world? Do you want to be in a timeline which liberates you? And we're going to start this hunger strike on October 17th, which is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. This poverty is due to the ordinary limits of thinking that keeps us repressed in the fragmented version of ourselves. You'll also notice that this is the last day of the panel. This is when the panel is. This is the last day of the series. So when we finish the discussion on that day, the next step that transitions this series into actuality, into actually carrying forward the solutions we want to see in the world, will begin in our current history. And so we have a saying with the refugees right now. It's our mantra with them, and it's heal the world together we can. And that the peaceful revolution has its own slogan, which is a miracle is happening and we all are the spark. Let's use this series to be the sparks. Please go to wiwa-w.com and let's create a peaceful revolution. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed.
Wow, thank you, Mark, for sharing your evolved thinking on this after the years of devotion. I'd like to open it up to discussion. We have half an hour remaining at least, and if we do want to continue, for those who want to stay on beyond 1:30, feel free to do that. And if you have time, Mark, I just want to say that I was a bit stunned by your announcement of this hunger strike. I wasn't aware of it this week, and you're being taken into a psychiatric assessment, and I'm grateful that the system didn't keep you there, and they saw the wisdom in letting you, your rationality, get you out again. A lot of people see what you're saying as being idealistic, as being incredibly naive. You addressed that yourself. You take on so many of the world's huge problems on your shoulders. I think in my introduction, I remarked what the legacy is for the younger generation to try to resolve. I've never met anyone who's found solutions, and you seem to be claiming to have them. So if people could ask you questions, please go ahead, either through the chat, okay, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. There is one question that I see from Carol Kaufman. Who are the refugees you are working with? She would like to, she supports your huge efforts. So there you go, Mark. You've got one convert on your side at this point.
Amazing. Well, they're on the call right now. I paid for Gia and Gustav. They're in Kenya right now in the Kakuma refugee camp. We met through WhatsApp. They're on the call now. I don't know if you two want to introduce yourselves.
Yes, hello. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm the one, please. I'm Gustav, refugee living in Kenya.
Hello, Gustav. Where are you from?
I'm in Kenya. It is
Yeah.
night time there. Yeah, it is important to see me at this time. Maybe I light myself. I don't know if you can see me there.
I'm trying to have a look. Are you from Afghanistan?
No, I'm not from Afghanistan. I'm from Congo, DRC. I'm living in
Ah,
Kenya. Here
bonjour.
we have a large number of refugees and they are from different countries. Bonjour, comment ça va?
Oui, très bien. Ma famille vient du Congo aussi, oui.
Could I
I
just
don't
let
know that
me
language
just
serious. I left the Congo when I was young.
so just let me just interrupt as the moderator. Jolene, could you turn the slides off, or Mark, could you turn the slides off so that we can see the participants and it will give us screen space to see everybody so that we can have a joint conversation looking into one another's faces?
I can't. Oh, there's the video.
Okay, I turned it off. It should work.
Yes, I see faces. Thank you, Mark. Jolene. Oh, there you are. Looking bearded. Oh, my goodness.
It's been a long journey, but a real one.
For those who met Mark at one of these sessions, I think it was in January, he was shaven at the time. No beard, no mustache. Okay, well, me too. I've grown a beard since then too. Okay, so Mark, there's been this introduction, and Carol, you now know where these people are speaking to you from.
Thank you.
Mark, you're welcome. Mark, could you say something? You mentioned the term dialectic quite a bit. Is dialectic, in your mind, the same thing as the dominant narrative, or the narrative by which societies tell stories and live their lives?
Yeah, well, it's the necessary movement of pure thought. It's the pure activity of what Hegel calls pure thought, and it comes through us in a myriad of different ways. It comes through our own limits. So whatever your limit is what the dialectic comes through as it actualizes pure thought into its own being. And it goes back between thinking and being in history. And there's a perfect version of this, a pure logical version, which scientists and logicians would love. It does this on itself and it's perfect logic, but then we are a version of that, but we're contingent. We have a bunch of different like combinations. Some are essential, some aren't perfect, some are. But the dialectic is the way, it's like the movement, it's the negative movement where spirit actualizes itself. And we all have a different version of it. That's why for many, many years, including the ancient Greeks, they interpreted dialectic to just mean a subjective dialectic. That means an argumentation, in talking to each other. So you can argue through dialectic, and it's a formal logical process of philosophy. But Hegel's the only one that came in that we know of, and he said, no, dialectic isn't just a subjective process, it's objective. That means that the world itself is pure thought, and it is also operating through these back and forth opposites that sublate each other and connect each other infinitely. And that if you grasp the true dialectic, then you end up with genuine philosophy like he did. If you have a finite version of it, if you can only grasp the dialectic in a fragmented form, then you're stuck in these oppositions until the dialectic forces you to sublate out of what's called the negative moment into the positive moment. So that's why we have a bunch of what looks like a bunch of different versions of dialectic as they come through our cultures worldwide. But really, there's only one logical dialectic, and Hegel's the one that purified it into the genuine, infinite scientific understanding of it, which we're now going to introduce starting with Spirit Mission and this new speculative way of teaching Hegel all over the world.
Thank you. I'm just going to read from the chat box. No one's asked a question other than two people have said, Gab, I don't know who Gab is, says, great talk, Mark. Thank you for your presentation and your efforts. And HP says, get me on WhatsApp. Oh, were you able to do that, Jolene? Thank you. I wouldn't know technically how to make that happen, but I see HP wearing a yellow shirt. Hello, HP. Okay, so since there are no other questions that I have, HP, you're on mute. If you want to say something, unmute yourself and speak, HP.
Okay. Hi to everyone.
Hello.
HP, do you want to ask a question? Or do you want to make a comment? I guess he just wanted to say hello. Well, welcome. While other people may be composing questions in their minds or putting them on the chat box or planning to unmute themselves to ask their questions, I have another question, Mark. As you know, I always have lots of questions for you. How do you see persuading the sociopaths of the world that a new logic is better and should replace the Slaughterbench logic? They are so invested in maintaining the status quo that I just can't understand. Maybe I'm just too ignorant and naive to understand, given my experience of dealing with sociopaths at the corporate and government levels through 50 years of my career.
As we study human nature more and more, and our finite science starts to approximate the genuine infinite science, we're going to be able to understand what creates those personalities on a logical level. And this is what psychoanalysis has tried to do for many years. And we have some famous psychoanalysts like Slavoj Žižek, Lacan. They studied Hegel, and they tried to apply his dialectic to modern psychiatry, modern psychoanalysis, to figure out what categories of thought create these aberrant personalities, which treat the world in negation, right? They're separated from the world. That's why they don't care about harming the world, because when they harm the world, they don't see it as a harm to self. They don't recognize with the external world enough to feel like there's consequences for their actions. And so there's something in the child mind that is learned, and it's learned through negation. That when you have a certain kind of chemical cocktail or a certain kind of epigenetic expression of the DNA, it creates these phenomenological modes, which we interpret as psychopathy, which is really just the negation, creating a separation between the subjective mind and the objective world. But Hegel says when you understand the true order of the categories, you can't help but noticing and self-recognizing the logic in the world. And this unites you with it. It creates a form of necessary self-recognition. And this kind of necessary self-recognition is what's missing in these people, because they are a product of the fractured thinking of the history, of the historical period that they're in. So the epoch is responsible for conditioning them, whether it's through their parents, whether it's their friends, whether it's through abuse, whether it's through the intergenerational trauma in their DNA already from previous negations in history. This is what's creating the disordered categories in their minds. So what we need to do is upgrade psychiatry to a new level of science where we understand these logical categories and build our therapies on them. And Hegel has done that. Hegel has actually said in his Philosophy of Spirit, he actually already outlined it, but it's so deep that our level of science isn't good enough to understand the clarity. So that's why we need a bunch of psychiatrists to study Hegel's logic and get them to start restructuring psychiatry, modern psychiatry, off of these new categories of thought to resolve those incredibly deep negations in those sociopaths. This is what rehabilitation in the prison system should be doing. To get to Lionel's presentation in the future.
Thank you. Lionel, I saw you were trying to say something at one point, but you were on mute. Did you want to say anything? And then unmute yourself if you do, please. Lionel, you're still muted. You're still muted, Lionel. It's either in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or Michael tells me it's in the top right-hand corner of his screen, the mute or unmute. There you go. No, something's changed though.
I'm just showing my fair trade coffee. In case somebody's wondering why I'm drinking unfair trade coffee, I'm not. It's fair trade certified.
Let me just remind, while Lionel's trying to unmute himself, Lionel, you're still muted. You succeeded last week in unmuting. Ah, there you go. You've succeeded, Lionel. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes, I'm trying to. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead and ask your question.
This is this talk is very foreign to me. But one of the things that I do begin to understand is this question of love, that we have failed to extend this love for humanity. And it's all about self and self-aggrandizement. And that for me I found most interesting. And it's something which I would love to be part of, extending this love for people and to move away from the destruction which we cause in our own lives and which we have caused all over the world. That's about all I can say. But thank you for inviting me to listen to this talk.
Thank you so much, Lionel, for those comments. Let me just remind everybody that in the series of 7 seminars, Mark has just done the 3rd of the 7. The 4th one next Sunday will be Jolene Young, who will be talking about historical and intergenerational trauma in South Africa. I'll talk the following week, that's on the 3rd of October, on how and why science is misused in support of dominant interests. And then Lionel, who you've just heard from, Lionel Davies, will speak on the 10th of October. He's a former Robben Island prisoner, and he will be leading a discussion about forgiveness. And then, as I mentioned before, on the final of these 7 series, on the 17th of October, which Mark has alerted me to the fact that it's International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, we'll be having this 1.5 or 2 hour, it's actually scheduled as a 2-hour session, a panel, including as many of the session speakers as possible on what we have learned and to what end. Okay, that's just my advertisement for the next few, and to put it all in context for people who haven't been hearing the previous 3 sessions, or the previous 2, and Mark's 3rd one today. Okay, so if there are any other questions, I see nothing in the chat. HP, is that you?
Yes.
Please go ahead and make a comment or ask a question of Mark or any one of us.
No, I don't have a comment. I just want to appreciate Mark because he's the only person who is forget. Really appreciate for that, and it is a better thing also for you and others also to be combined with Mark to maybe also he can reach his target to get all those people which he need in these few days, those who want to maybe to like the page, to be taught with Mark, because we have many training that people are supposed to be taught, and the training will be done by Mark, who is in Canada. So I really appreciate for that, and thanks for everyone who attend this training, and it is better and it's good for us. By the way, my sister's director, the connection was not good on his side, but all information will get it from me. I appreciate for that. And by the name Gustav Kashindi. For those who didn't hear about my name, I'm living in Kenya. Mark, I'm getting you.
I'm getting you too. I'm back.
Yes.
I do want to say one last thing.
By the way, yes, Mark is a good person. Yes, he's a good person. We appreciate that. We appreciate for the rating you did a good work, and it is hard work, by the way.
Same to you guys. I do want to say one more thing though, Colin, before you close out the session, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I know at first the ordinary thinking, like we're all trapped in ordinary thinking. I'm just breaking out. It's very, very, very difficult. And I know what it looks like I said isn't the solution to all the problems we're talking to in this series. But I am so confident that the only way out of the Slaughterbench is through this logic that I'm willing to stake my life on it in a hunger strike. And that's going to start on October 17th. We have no time to wait. This 1/3 wealth concentration is happening incredibly fast. And if we don't get this logic into the world within the next year or two, it's going to be too late. I think there's a very high likelihood the wealth concentration is going to be so high that there's going to be a tipping point where oppression might not be able to reverse properly. And we might end up in this stage called the negative moment of reason that Hegel talks about, where the dialectic can nullify itself. So for me, I really feel like time is of the essence. And to speed that up, in order to get ordinary thinking pushed in this direction, you have to create a passion. You have to create an urgency. And I'm going to use my life for that. I'm going to do that in a month from now. Whether or not people join me or anything, I'm so convinced of what I've told you. I have studied philosophy for thousands of hours. I've studied everything I possibly can since I was 13 years of age. There's nothing that is even close to this. And I'm that confident and so worried about this timeline that I really urge you to do everything you can based on what I've said. Go over the presentation again and again and again. I had to for 3,000 hours on top of my life experience. Go over it in the next month and try and get to the hunger strike worldwide as much as you possibly can so that it's not a waste. So I'm really committed to this. I'm really glad you guys have listened. And I think we can change history if we can get over this ordinary thinking that is causing so much pain in our society.
Mark, thank you for clarifying that. I'd just like you to clarify one other thing. At the beginning, we do have at least 10 more minutes to go till the half-hour time arrives. You did at the very beginning make the point that this was not a suicide mission that you were on, but a hunger strike. I'm therefore assuming, I'm a bit confused because when one talks about a hunger strike, it can result in, if you don't see the action you're asking for, it could be that you don't eat or drink and you do indeed leave this world, which I would hate to see happen personally. So the question is, are you doing this just to gain attention? And then as soon as you've got some measurable amount of attention, you will go back to eating and drinking? I know you're a vegetarian, so you eat like a bird anyway, but go ahead, tell me.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm outside of A&W is because they're the only big chain that has like a vegan option with fair trade certified coffee, just to let you know. But yeah, it's very serious. And the thing that makes me a little bit, I guess, disappointed in some of the people who are supposed to be on this journey with me is when I first stated the hunger strike, I said it in a rational way. I said, this could go until death or until peaceful revolution. So there's always an out. And a hunger strike, nobody ever goes in it to get hurt. But if it's not serious, people don't take it seriously, right? You're believing in something so strongly that you're willing to take a risk for it because the alternative risk is greater or just as great. So for me, I think we are in very hot water. The trends that we're going, whether it's climate change, the pandemic has exposed, I think for all of us, the fragmented thinking in our history, in our current culture. And so for me, I'm letting people know that I want to live in a much more blessed world. And I don't want to end up hurt. I'm just trying to get people to overcome their ordinary thinking and make the effort. Right now, nobody's really making the effort because the pandemic has drained them. But that's the problem, is that you have to overcome that moment. It's very, very hard. And to help people overcome it, you have to show them your passion, that you really do care about them and you're willing to take a risk for them. And a lot of people in Canada who I'm asking for help, who have millions of dollars, who could literally start this CRISPR lab and start the WeWa app at a snap of a finger if they really wanted to, they're trapped in this kind of semi-comfort and this sort of first world problem kind of discomfort, that they don't have this urgency to the problem. But when you go to refugees, when you go to India, who's still devastated, when you go to Syria, who's probably going to be recovering from the pandemic for 57 more years, according to current studies, those people understand that now is the time. They're suffering now. And there's an urgency that I'm trying to get people to experience, because when you start developing the speculative dialectical logic, you really do start to experience a connection with the world that transcends fragmented borders of family or of even your nation or your color or your creed. You start to identify with everybody and you start feeling their truth, their pain. You start understanding that that could have been you if things would have been different in your life, if the logic would have been different. And so there's this incredible rational empathy that drives you to want to help them, to want to do these things like a hunger strike. And I'm feeling that. And my studies of Hegel, I've always felt that since I was young. I was born with this feeling of being a philosopher, but Hegel has shown me that I was born to be a genuine philosopher, to come into this world and change it. And he's given me that language to express what I always knew. And I want to share that with the world and create that urgency that even though we are suffering in our world, we need to start thinking in a holistic way, or else we're going to fragment, and this 1/3 wealth concentration is going to subjugate us. And we need to turn that thinking around. And I hope that I can inspire people to do that and make that transition very, very quickly and start teaching as we're going, as people start asking the real questions, the real investment. So I don't want to get hurt. I have an escape route, and I'm asking you all to help me with it. And I provided a month. That's quite a bit of time to ask some serious questions. Every minute counts to those who are dying. There's people starving around the world as we speak. So every moment does count. And a month is this, I don't know. I chose it because it's the International Day of Poverty. It's the end of the series. It's short enough that it doesn't drag the process on, but it's also long enough that it gives us all time to actually start investigating what I've talked about here. Because all of the talks in this series, and one way or the other, is still, if they have a real solution, including Lionel's, which is forgiveness, it all happens through this process of logical self-recognition in explicit human consciousness. I know that sounds like word soup, but I'm very, very confident that this is the only real way. And there's approximate ways, but this is the quickest way. And I'm very excited to see how other talkers use their language to explore that. But I really think we need to accelerate, because these problems are moving at a rate that is far faster than we're currently moving. And I really think that we can catch up through a hunger strike and a peaceful revolution.
Mark, I have a question. Jolene or anybody else, feel free to ask questions too. Jolene, I've never heard you so silent. Has Mark stunned the audience with his message? I just want to point out to you, Mark, that I did hear you say, thank you. I just want to point out to Mark that when we were talking, you were answering my question about sociopaths and psychiatric paradigms and diagnostic abilities. And I heard you say it's going to take years. You certainly didn't talk about days or months, but I heard you mention years to get that sorted out. So my concern is this one then, in terms of the timeline that you set for yourself. You mentioned the word sensuousness. And I interpret sensuousness, and I may be completely in error in doing this, but I interpret it as an investment in something that you hold dear, whether it's your corporation or whether it's your family or whether it's your career or your profession or your craft or whatever it is. And this investment is in the status quo. So you have a hell of a lot to lose by giving that up and saying, this guy from Alberta, who's making a lot of sense in identifying all these problems and may indeed be the true philosopher, the philosopher king, or whatever you're terming this from Hegel, I don't see how that timing fits with your reality of this month coming up. Because it seems to me that there's a lot of work yet to be done before this next step could be worked towards.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the criterion on how to end the hunger strike, to make it clear, okay, when do we reach the threshold where it's believable that we're on our way to a peaceful revolution? That will be outlined in terms of the activist principles that I have learned over the last 10 years on critical mass, on the rates of idea transfer, all these sort of recent metrics, scientific metrics and studies in social movements. These are becoming available, especially in big data movements. I'm going to outline those as my criterion for ending the hunger strike, so that it can be almost like a checkbox where when we reach them, then it'll be very clear that you can end the hunger strike. Even though it looks like this challenge is insurmountable and it will take years and years and years, to get it started, to get to this first stage, doesn't take years and years and years. And all of these kind of powerful men in history understood what Hegel has said, and I'm understanding it more and more and more each day that I'm on this path, that there's a famous line that Lenin once said. And he said, in history, sometimes there's periods of decades where weeks of progress happen, and sometimes there's weeks where decades of progress happen. And I think this hunger strike is going to trigger a very short period of weeks, maybe months, where decades of progress that should have happened, but have not happened through the stagnation over the last 40 years, those will happen in weeks because of the science around the 6 degrees of separation and the amazing people that I have met and attracted into my life through the 10 years of Make Poverty History and the spiritual journey I committed myself to since I was 13 years of age. I have a group of 40 superheroes, I call them, in a Facebook chat that I believe have access to about 10 to 20 million if they got serious and realized the real problem that we're in. And if they get inspired, it would only take a couple of Facebook messages to spread to all these networks from degree 1 to degree 6 on LinkedIn or whatever, for people to realize that we can raise easily $1 million to start creating the WeWa app and to start the CRISPR lab within a day. These things are exponentially quick. They're very, very, very fast. It's just the thing that's holding us back right now is the lack of spirit and the lack of passion to believe that this is the solution. So what I hope happens is in the next month, people take it seriously what I've presented in this talk, and they start to realize it makes a lot more sense than their ordinary thinking is letting them think. And it happens quickly, because I've sorted it through in this talk very, very quickly, what took me thousands of hours to learn. In 4 weeks, you can get to a point of where you understand the logic, the logic to the point of where you will believe in it more, where you realize, yes, I've never seen anything like this. There's nobody else doing this. I want to put my money behind this. And if I don't fully understand, at least I believe in this guy who's going to try. I'm willing to give this much money. And this, with all my friends, will raise approximately 1 million or whatever we need to reach this checkbox to believe that we can now make the WeWa app and attempt the CRISPR lab for real and not just with words. So these things are possible, and we see them in history, and we can see them even in modern society. Movements happen exponentially fast. And I think we are at the cusp of one of those right now.
Well, thanks for that clarification, Mark. I know there's the saying, the power of one, and you certainly are a power of one at the moment, and hopefully it will grow to be heard by others and acted on by others. Any other questions from anybody at all? I see names that I've seen on the superhero group on the call. If anyone would like to add anything, or a perspective, a concern, an issue. Challenge Mark. I know he responds well to being challenged. He thrives on being challenged, I think.
Colin, I just wanted to ask, I don't know why I've hidden my face and I can't unhide it, whatever. Anyway, I just wanted to ask, Mark, you're talking about ordinary thinking. And all of us being individuals, I think there's so many diverse thoughts that happen all the time. So who gets to decide what ordinary thinking is?
For me, this is the challenge of authority, right? And for me, that's why it was very important to tie all of these documents, whether it's Spirit Mission, WeWa, CRISPR, it was very important to tie these to academia. And so for me, the highest authority that we should turn to make those standards, those criterions defined, is Hegel. And Hegel is respected all around the world and is considered the greatest philosopher, or one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And I believe after studying him, he has created a standard that is the highest in the world and hasn't been understood for 200 years. So that's who I would turn to say, this is the guy that has the authority to make that call, and that all of our other acts of goodness around the world are great acts. They're just fragmented, and the fragmentation is slowly achieving a higher spirit. But my concern is that this other dynamic, this repressive, oppressive dynamic, which is this 1/3 wealth concentration to the limits of global capitalism, that's moving far faster than all these other movements together, and that it will come over and have a power over us where we might not be able to overcome it. And so for me, this is about accelerating, and the greatest authority we could possibly align ourselves with that has the most defendable truth, whether spiritually, philosophically, academically, colloquially, ordinarily, is this man and his philosophy, Hegel.
Thanks. It's interesting to hear Jolene ask that question. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat as yet, or anyone's unmuting themselves to ask a question. So let me just comment on follow up from what Jolene just asked you. It was a note that I had made to myself. Would life on this planet, given the diversity of humans, Jolene, I think this is an extension of what you asked, would life not be boring or dull if everyone were to be thinking equally or on the same plane or in the same way? I mean, this is a scary thought to people who believe in individuality, and but not individual, it's a delicate balance between individuality and the collective good. And some of us have spent our careers working on that very issue. So I don't know if that's something you could tackle, Mark.
Yeah, that's the mistake that Marx and Lenin and the communists made, is that they didn't understand the logic between the state and the individual, and especially Stalin. And so what I did is I made sure I understood those dialectics before devising the peaceful revolution, to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. And that mistake is that you have to include everything and everybody, and that you have to have the speculative component where you think in contradictions, but it's a unified ideal contradiction. So that means the peaceful revolution, for example, isn't rejecting capitalism. It's not rejecting socialism. It's not rejecting communism. It's accepting capitalism, socialism, and communism, but it's putting them in their true limits. So everything has truth. The thing that makes them wise or not is the way you position them in their logical order. And I believe Hegel put them in their logical order like nobody else could. And so what he said was, there's actually a logical relationship between the universal and the individual. And that relationship is mediated by the particular. The particular is what preserves the infinite diversity of the individual, but also maintains the inner unity, which is the logic that connects the infinite variety to a one reasoning. And the reasoning is what preserves the harmony in the difference. So that's why I said earlier that there is a unity with the logic, but the sensuous remains infinitely diverse. So Canada is one of the closest countries to approximating this kind of divine infinite scientific logic with their sort of cultural salad. But what they're missing is the higher rationality, the higher cultural competence that genuinely creates that harmony, rather than just putting it in policies in an abstract way. And the only way to do it in a concrete way, the only way to upgrade our cultural rights and freedoms through the Canadian Declaration of Human Rights, our Constitution, is by incorporating the order of the categories that Hegel has outlined, and then showing when it's appropriate to impose one's culture, when it's not, when to have freedom in this area, when not. And this is the only guy that I think provides a deep enough culture to actually make that upgrade without fragmenting it further. So what we're doing is the ideal balance between individuality and the universal, and it happens in this way that I've discussed in the presentation, where everybody is a particular reasoning individual, a particular spirit that participates in this higher rational spirit. And it's the rational spirit which can be dressed up in any sensuous mode that you want. That's why we have, thousands of languages and thousands of cultures. They're all the same logic, but the logic doesn't get boring because the sensuousness provides the novelty and the poetry that makes it beautiful. And it's that beauty that the logic makes out of the sensuous rather than the Slaughterbench. But we're missing that interpretive mode. And that's what this new peaceful revolution is going to put in place, so that the individuality isn't negated. It's actually preserved, but in an ideal way, in a wise way.
Thanks, Mark. I see that Rav, I've been told by Jolene that Rav put up his hand. So if Rav would like to ask a question, but while he's preparing to do that, Katrina says, hello, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for a wonderful presentation. Just understood that Mark needs urgently material resources for this peaceful revolution. I suggested to Mark to go and spread his word to wealthy but trapped, unhappy people who throw away a lot of money at casinos, for example. I just don't know how to raise that much money so fast. Any thoughts? Well, I think, Mark, you were just asking people to donate $5 or $10 each, right, at the time. And Carol Kaufman, just before Rav, and then this will be the last question in the interests of time. We're now over the period. Hang on, this is Bienvenue or Nos Amis de Kenya. Courage, the social action you are taking will focus more attention on the inequities of our world. So it's a good thing, and you show your love for the dispossessed by this attention. Thank you, Mark. Rav, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Hey, Mark. Hey, good to see you there. Yeah, thanks for this. This is probably the best summary of everything you've been talking about for all these years that I've seen gathered together in one talk. And I think it's good that it's recorded, because we can use that to kind of show other people. And it's a good summary. And I thought you did a really good job. One question I guess I have is, you kind of mentioned, there's so many like an ordinary timeline, I guess there's so many it depends on which timeline you're on, what the sense of urgency is, whether it's you're on the timeline of somebody on death row, or somebody in a refugee camp that's living a pretty hard life, or somebody who, any of us on Earth that are looking at the timeline of climate change within a few decades, or the timeline that you mentioned of wealth concentration being so high that it may be irreversible. And I'm just thinking, but on the other hand, a lot of what you're saying, like in Hinduism, you call it sat. Sat is like truth, or things that are timeless. Like, as you also have defined, things that are true are basically, they are true across all time. And that's actually the definition of things that are true, sat. So if you get to these points, say of like 1/3 wealth concentration, you kind of said that it gets to a point where it may be very difficult to overcome such a thing. But we've overcome as a species so many other repressions, so many other much more extreme wealth concentration in history than what you're referring to. So what happens if we get to that point of, I'm not talking about climate change, because there are irreversible climate change and we live in a physical world, but what happens if we get to this sort of wealth concentration that is very difficult to surmount, as you say, and we're here 100 years from now and we've made some progress, but we haven't made the progress that you would have wanted to see? What would the person 100 years from now, say, living in a refugee camp, what would they be doing? What would you say to that? Is that even a possibility?
Yeah, there's this weird quasi state where it doesn't go to one extreme or the other, like the blessed extreme or like the complete oppressive, like dystopian extreme. And we're in this sort of like gray area where things kind of continue as they are. And, people are oppressed, but they're still alive. And you get this kind of subsistence culture or survival where you have like a cream of the crop on top and everybody else is just surviving. And it's very painful. It's not a liberation of spirit. You can feel yourself alienated from the purpose of life almost. You get this sort of lack of motivation inside of you, which is almost in some cases worse than death. It's like this hollowing out of a sense of who you are, a sense of purpose, and it can create depression and anxiety or a numbness or a zombification of who you are and what the point of your life is. And you can continue in this mode for a long time, but it separates you from the essence of your humanity. And you can survive in that state, but it's not ideal. And our goal is to, because I've grown up in that state and I was born in the poverty line in Canada, I know viscerally what it's like. And there are times where it's very bleak. And when you start self-recognizing with people in that position, it starts to generate an urgency in you. It's like an automatic. It's what empathy basically is, right? And you start to get to a point where it becomes unbearable to your own dignity, because this rationality, this creative spirit that allows you to self-actualize into higher modes of thinking, that's not just something you do. Rationality is not just something you do. Hegel says it's something that you are. And if somebody alienates you from that, they're not just alienating your thinking from yourself, they're actually hurting your entire being. And so over time, this sort of erosion of who you are is one of the greatest crimes you can do to somebody. It removes the dignity and it resorts you back to an animal. So it's one of the most dehumanizing things you can do. And we really, if we respect ourselves as human beings that are self-determining and reasonable and rational creatures, that it is our purpose and our end to actualize this higher spirit, which is the truth of human nature. And do it with the speed of love. Every minute counts.
Thanks, Mark. Rav, do you want to ask him anything back, or Jolene, do we need to wind down the session now? I'll hand it over to Jolene to.
Absolutely.
Handing it over. Sorry, just let me say, Jolene, in handing it over, thank you, Mark, so much for sharing all of this with us, and your very being is clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Yeah,
It was a blessed moment in history.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing your thinking and your viewpoint and your vision and your passion for the work that you do. As Lionel says, for many of us, you're coming with something that might be foreign to us in our thinking. I don't know whether that means that we are all ordinary thinkers, as you would say, that we just think differently and that we all have different perceptions about things. And my wish for you, Mark, is that you achieve the goodness and the love that you wish to achieve without any harm coming to you, without you going on a hunger strike where you come to physical harm. So, you know, I think also with love, I find that human beings are by nature fearful. And the minute you come to people with a way of thinking that is different, I'm not liking you to Jesus in any way, but I think of Jesus who came with a, you know, he came to the earth and had these ideas and people feared him. And the minute people fear you, people feared Lionel because he was coming with ideas. And some people come with ideas for, you know, out of goodness. And then we also have to be careful of power and what power does to ourselves, you know, because you're also doing something that could put you in a position of great power in terms of people wanting to follow you and to follow your thinking. And then you have this huge responsibility now as to how you're going to manage that, because power can always be so destructive. So, you know, I think it's walking that narrow line. There's a lot that you've said that I want to watch again and get a greater, you know, sense of, because what you've spoken about is not only for me about Hegel, but also about ideas and that you want to put forward, about certain actions that you're wanting to take forward, as with the hunger strike, for example. And I feel that, you know, I just wish you well and hope that everything is done in a way that will bring more love and peace and the positivity that you are reaching out to do, because this is obviously what, I see how to show self-view. This is obviously what Colin and Michael were thinking about when they asked me to arrange these talks, was their concern about repression, revenge, and how we handle that. But we also, because I do work, you know, I take communities around and I share messages about very tragic things that have happened in our history, and so does Lionel. But we also, and I think Lionel would be with me, that we also have to do it in a way that is so responsible, because human beings can be so unpredictable. So we have to do, even our messages of love, we have to carry them with great responsibility, so that we are engendering more love and not creating fearful division. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you to everyone who joined tonight. It was wonderful having you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natsi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you
very much. A miracle is happening. We all are the spark.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
See
you all
Colin.
next Sunday at the same time.
See you guys.
You thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
And
Carol.
goodbye. Thank you very much.
I see you, Carol.
Hi, Lionel. And Gil. Lovely to
It's
see
good
our
to
brothers from Congo. Yeah. Au revoir. Bonsoir.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.